What Tessa Whitfield didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing in the freezing rain with her horse and her map dissolving in her hands, was that the castle on the ridge above her was not abandoned. She had been told it was. Every cartographer's guild note about the Ashenmore Highlands described the old Holloway Keep as empty, a ruin left to weather and wolves after the border wars ended 3 years ago. No garrison, no staff, no lord in residence, just stone walls and silence and a good landmark for triangulating the northern survey lines. So when the storm split open the sky like a wound, and her mare stumbled on a rain-slicked ridge trail, pulling up short with a foreleg she refused to bear weight on, Tessa did what any reasonable woman alone in the mountains would do. She led the horse uphill toward the only shelter for 20 miles and shouldered her way through the castle's front gate without knocking. The gate opened easily, too easily, oiled hinges, recent fire ash in the courtyard brazier, a stable block with fresh straw, and a water trough that wasn't frozen. Tessa stopped in the courtyard, rain hammering her leather riding jacket, her strawberry blonde braid plastered heavy and dripping against her neck, and thought, someone lives here. The main doors opened before she could turn around. He filled the doorway the way a mountain fills a horizon, not with effort, but with the simple fact of existing in a space that seemed built to hold him. Tall, broad through the shoulders, barefoot on cold stone, which struck her as either supremely confident or slightly unhinged. His hair was sandy brown, left to fall naturally past his ears and across his brow, the kind of length that suggested a man who forgot about barbers rather than one who avoided them. He wore a dark burgundy wool tunic, long-sleeved and loose, unlaced at the throat, and he was holding a book in one hand like she had interrupted something far more interesting than a stranger breaking into his home. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Dark olive green, the color of deep forest at dusk, and looking at her with an expression that wasn't anger or surprise, or even curiosity. It was recognition. Something crackled beneath Tessa's skin. Not a spark, not a shock. A slow, building hum, like the air before a lightning strike when the charge has gathered but hasn't yet found its target. She pressed her hand against her chest, confused. The hum intensified. "Your horse is lame," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world and was content with the arrangement. Tessa blinked rain out of her eyes. "I know. I was there." The corner of his mouth twitched. "There's a stable through the arch. Warm stall, dry grain. I'll look at the leg. I can manage my own horse." "I don't doubt that." He stepped aside and held the door wider. "But the storm is going to last, and that leg won't carry you down the mountain for at least a week." A week? Tessa looked at the sky. The clouds were stacked in thick, rolling layers of charcoal and iron, the kind of deep weather formation that settled over highlands and simply refused to move. She had been mapping these mountains long enough to know what that sky meant. This wasn't a passing squall. This was a siege. "Who are you?" she asked, because it seemed important to establish that before she walked into a stranger's castle. He studied her for a moment. Rain ran down the door frame and pooled around his bare feet, and he didn't seem to notice or care. "Tiernan," he said. Just the name. No title. No family. Just a man in a doorway, holding a book, offering shelter. "Tessa," she said. "Whitfield. I'm a cartographer with the Western Guild." I know what a cartographer does. Most people don't. Most people don't live alone in a mountain castle with a library full of survey records. He tilted his head. "Come inside, Tessa Whitfield. You're soaking through your maps." She was. She could feel the parchment in her satchel going soft, the ink running. Hours of careful mountain surveys blurring into nothing. She had two choices: stand in the rain and watch her work dissolve, or walk through his door. She walked through his door. The castle was not a ruin. That was the first thing Tessa noticed, as Tiernan led her through the main hall. The stone floors were swept. The walls had been replastered in places. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, and the warmth of it hit her like a wall after hours in the cold rain. But the place was also clearly inhabited by a single person. The hall was furnished, but only in the areas immediately surrounding the fireplace. One chair, one table, one iron candelabra with half-melted candles. The rest of the vast room stretched away into shadow, unused. A castle built for hundreds, occupied by one. The library is through there. Tiernan gestured with the book he hadn't put down. The kitchen is down the corridor to the left. There are rooms upstairs. Take whichever one doesn't have a leak. The east wing has a collapsed section I haven't gotten around to repairing, so avoid that. You live here alone? I do. In a castle. It was available? She wanted to press, but something in his tone suggested the answer came with a cost she hadn't earned the right to ask for yet. So she nodded, dripped across his floor, and went to find a room. She chose one on the second floor, small by castle standards but dry, with a bed that had been made up with thick quilts and a window that overlooked the valley. The storm obscured most of the view, but she could see the ridge trail she had climbed, already running with brown water. She would not be leaving that way anytime soon. The humming in her chest had not faded. If anything, it was louder now that she was inside his walls. It pulsed faintly when she thought of him, the way a compass needle trembled when it found north. She pressed both palms flat against the stone window ledge and breathed until it settled. She had been mapping the Ashenmoor Range for 3 months. Before that, the coastal lowlands of the southern province. Before that, the marshes near the capital. She had been moving continuously for 5 years since she joined the guild at 19, and in all that time she had never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Maps were her excuse. There was always another ridge to survey, another river to trace, another blank space on the parchment that needed filling. The blank spaces on the parchment were easier than the ones inside her. When she came downstairs, Tiernan was in the kitchen, sliding bread from a clay oven with his bare hands like the heat didn't register. He had set out 2 bowls of stew, 2 cups, a clay pitcher of something that smelled like spiced mead. 2 settings, like he had been expecting company. "You bake your own bread?" she said from the doorway. "There's no one else to do it." "That's not an answer. That's a circumstance." He looked up, and his eyes caught the firelight in a way that turned the olive green to something warmer, something almost gold at the edges. "Yes," he said. "I bake my own bread. Sit down, Tessa." She sat. The bread was exceptional. She didn't tell him that. The humming in her chest told him anyway, somehow, and from the way his hand stilled on his cup, she knew he felt it too. By the 3rd day, Tessa had mapped every accessible room in the castle. Not because she needed to, because mapping was what she did when she was nervous, and Tiernan Holloway made her nervous in ways she didn't have cartographic notation for. He was quiet, not withdrawn, quiet in the way that deep water was quiet. He moved through his own castle with a fluid ease that suggested a man completely at home in his body, barefoot on cold stone, stirring pots without measuring, building fires that caught on the first strike. He read constantly, pulling books from the library shelves with the casual familiarity of someone who had been through the entire collection at least once and was circling back to favorites. But it was what he didn't do that unsettled her. He didn't ask why she traveled alone. He didn't comment on the ink stains on her hands or the way she spread her maps across every flat surface without asking permission. He didn't try to fill silences with conversation. He simply existed alongside her, a steady presence in the periphery of her awareness that she couldn't stop tracking no matter how hard she tried. The current between them had grown. That was the only word for it. Current. Like a river building beneath the surface. On the first day, it had been a hum. By the 3rd day, it was a pull, a low electrical charge that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up when he passed close and made her breath catch when his hand brushed hers, reaching for the same book. They were in the library when it happened. Tessa had found the survey records he had mentioned, decades of Highland topographical data, meticulously catalogued, that would fill gaps in the guild's maps that had frustrated cartographers for years. She was cross-referencing them against her own field notes, bent over a table with parchment spreading in every direction, when Tiernan set a cup of tea beside her elbow without being asked. "You've been at this for 6 hours," he said. "Has it been 6 hours? You miss lunch." "I don't miss meals." "You miss this one." He leaned against the table beside her, arms crossed, and the proximity sent the current surging through her so intensely she had to grip the edge of the table. His jaw tightened. He felt it too. "Eat something. The maps will still be here tomorrow." "That's the problem," she said before she could stop herself. He was quiet for a long moment. "What do you mean?" She should not have said it. But 3 days of forced proximity and a charge building between them like a storm that refused to break had worn away the careful walls she'd spent 5 years constructing. And the truth came out before she could catch it. "I don't stay places, Tiernan. I pass through. I chart the landscape, and I move on. That's how it works. That's how I work." She gestured at the maps, the records, the library with its tall windows rattling in the wind. "But these records, this castle, these—" She cut herself off. "You." She had almost said you. "I'm going to have to leave when the storm breaks, and I don't want to fill in spaces I'm going to have to walk away from." He didn't respond immediately. He studied her face with those dark olive-green eyes, and the current between them hummed so loudly she could feel it in the soles of her feet. "My brother built this library," he said. The words came out carefully, like each one had a weight he was choosing to carry. "He was the one who collected the survey records. He loved this valley, knew every ridgeline, every watershed. He died in the border wars, and I sealed the highlands, closed the passes, told the world to stay away." Tessa went still. "I came up here afterward because I didn't know where else to go. I told myself it was temporary. That was 3 years ago." He looked at the bookshelves, and something crossed his face that she recognized with a sharp, painful clarity. The expression of someone who had chosen isolation as armor, and then forgotten how to take it off. "I understand not wanting to fill in spaces you can't stay in, Tessa. I've been standing inside an empty one for 3 years." The castle groaned around them. Wind screamed against the windows, and Tessa stood in a library full of maps and records and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had loved this land, and she looked at the man who had shut the world out to grieve for him, and the current between them stopped humming. It sang. "You're the Alpha King," she said quietly. Not a question. The survey records were stamped with a crown seal. The castle bore the Holloway crest above every mantle. She had known since the first morning. She just hadn't said it. Does that change anything? She thought about it, about titles and power and the distance they created, about the fact that he had introduced himself as just Tiernan, barefoot and holding a book, and had spent 3 days baking bread and making tea and reading beside her in silence like she was the only company he had wanted in years. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She kissed him on the 5th day. They were in the Tower Observatory, the highest point of the castle, a round room with glass windows on every side that turned the storm into something you could watch, like a living painting. Rain lashed the glass in sheets. Lightning turned the mountains white for half a second at a time. The wind sounded like something alive, howling through the gaps in the stone and rattling the iron frames. Tiernan had brought her up to see the view. He had draped a heavy knit slate cloak over his tunic against the cold of the unheated tower, and in the blue-white flash of lightning he looked like something carved from the mountain itself, solid, ancient, inevitable. She had been drawing, sitting on the stone floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up as a desk, sketching the view through the east-facing window because mapping was still the only language she trusted completely. He had been standing at the opposite window, watching the storm, his hands braced on the stone sill in a way that made the muscles in his forearms tighten visibly. "Tiernan." He turned. The lightning flashed, and she saw what he looked like when he wasn't guarding his expression. open and raw and aching with something that looked like hope held so tightly it was almost fear. The current between them had become unbearable. 5 days of proximity. 5 days of shared meals and quiet conversations, and his hand on the small of her back, guiding her past the collapsed section of the east wing. 5 days of building charge with no release, and she could feel it in her chest, her throat, the palms of her hands. She stood up. Her sketchbook fell to the floor. She crossed the room in 4 steps, took his face between her hands, and kissed him. The world went electric. Not a spark. Not a jolt. A full-body surge of current that started where her lips met his and flooded through every nerve, every vein, until she could feel the hum of it in her teeth and her fingertips and the arches of her feet. His hands came to her waist, careful at first, then firm, pulling her closer with a deliberateness that made her gasp against his mouth. He kissed her back like he had been waiting. Not 5 days. Longer. Years, maybe. A lifetime of standing in empty rooms and sealed-off castles and highland passes closed to the world, waiting for someone to walk through his gate and refuse to leave. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. His breathing was ragged. His hands were trembling where they held her waist, and the current between them had settled into something deep and constant, like the vibration of a struck bell that would never stop ringing. "That's going to make it harder to leave," she whispered. "Then don't." 2 words, no title behind them, no command, just a man who had been alone for 3 years, standing in a tower above the clouds, asking her to stay. She closed her eyes and pressed her face into the side of his neck, and he held her while the storm raged on every side, and neither of them moved for a very long time. The storm broke on the 7th morning. Tessa woke to silence. For 6 days, the wind had been a constant presence, howling, rattling, screaming through the gaps in the stone. She had fallen asleep to it, and woken to it and mapped to the rhythm of it. The silence was louder than any of it. She lay still in the bed and stared at the ceiling. Beside her on the nightstand, her maps were stacked and organized, cross-referenced with Tiernan's survey records, annotated in her careful hand. The best work she had ever done. A week's worth of work that should have taken months, because the records in his library had filled every gap she had been chasing across 3 provinces. Her satchel was packed. Her riding jacket hung on the back of the chair, dry and brushed. Her boots stood by the door, laces tightened. The mare's leg had healed. She had checked yesterday. The horse could carry her down the mountain by midday. Tessa got up, dressed, braided her hair, packed the last of her supplies. She moved through each task with the precise, practiced efficiency of a woman who had broken camp 100 times, in 100 places, and never once looked back. She found Tiernan in the kitchen. He was standing at the hearth, stirring something in an iron pot with a wooden spoon, barefoot, burgundy tunic, hair falling across his brow. He looked exactly as he had on the first day, the day she had walked through his gate soaking wet and furious, and utterly unprepared for what she would find inside. He looked up when she entered. His eyes moved from her face to the packed satchel on her shoulder to the riding jacket buttoned to her throat, and something shifted behind the dark olive green. Not surprise. He had known this was coming. He had always known. "Storm broke," he said. "I heard." He nodded, set down the spoon, wiped his hands on a cloth that hung from the hearth hook. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't argue or plead or remind her of the kiss in the tower or the nights they had spent talking until the candles burned down to nothing. He just stood there, looking at her with an expression of such careful, controlled devastation that it made her chest crack open. "The survey records," she started. "Keep them." His voice was steady. Almost. "My brother would have wanted them in the hands of someone who understood what they meant." Tessa's throat tightened. The current between them was humming so loudly now that she could feel it in her bones, a deep, insistent pull that said, "Stay, stay, stay," with every beat of her heart. She pressed her hand against her sternum hard, as if she could quiet it. "I mapped your castle," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Every room, every corridor, the library, the kitchen, the tower with the glass windows. I've never mapped a place I've stayed in before. I chart the landscape, and I move on. That's how it works." "I know. But I mapped yours. Every corner of it. Down to the crack in the east wing wall and the spot by the hearth where the stone is warm enough to sit on barefoot." She swallowed hard. "I don't map places I'm passing through, Tiernan. I map places I want to remember." He didn't move, didn't speak. But his hand, the one resting on the edge of the table, had gone white-knuckled. "The gate will be open," he said quietly. "Whenever you come back, it will be open." She nodded, adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder, walked past him, through the great hall with its one chair and its massive hearth, and out the front door into a morning so clear and bright it hurt. The courtyard was washed clean. The sky was rinsed blue, impossibly blue, the kind of blue that only existed after a storm had scrubbed every cloud from the atmosphere. The mountains rose sharp and vivid on every side, their peaks crowned with fresh snow that caught the early sunlight like something sacred. Her mare was saddled and waiting by the gate. The stable boy— no, there was no stable boy. Tiernan had saddled the horse himself. Before dawn, while she was still sleeping, she gathered the reins, led the mare through the gate, stepped onto the ridge trail and looked down the mountain at the valley below, where the rivers were running high and the meadows were flooded silver and the world stretched out in every direction, waiting to be mapped. She took 3 steps, then she stopped. The current in her chest was not humming anymore. It was roaring. A wild, furious electric surge that started in the center of her ribcage and radiated outward until her hands were shaking and her vision blurred and every cell in her body was screaming the same word. Home, not a place, not a coordinate on a map, not a set of walls or a roof or a fire in a hearth. A person. A man standing barefoot in a kitchen, baking bread alone in a castle he had sealed off from the world because grief had made the world too loud. Tessa turned around. She walked back through the gate, across the courtyard, and through the front door. Tiernan was exactly where she had left him, standing by the hearth with his hands braced on the table and his head bowed. He looked up when the door opened, and the expression on his face, the raw, unguarded shock of a man who had let himself hope and been answered, broke her completely. "The storm stopped," she said. Her voice was shaking. "I noticed. And I'm still here." He straightened slowly. "I see that." She dropped the satchel, crossed the room, took his face in her hands the way she had in the tower, and this time when she kissed him the current didn't surge. It settled. Deep and warm and steady, like the hum of the earth beneath a mountain, like something that had always been there and had only been waiting to be found. "I have never stayed anywhere," she whispered against his mouth. "Not once in 5 years." "I know." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones, those dark olive-green eyes so close she could see the gold flecks at their centers. "And I have never asked anyone to." "I'm not staying because you asked." "Why then?" She pulled back just enough to look at him. "Because I mapped every room in this castle, and when I got to the last one, I realized I wasn't cataloging a building. I was drawing my way home." His breath caught. Something broke open behind his eyes. Not the careful, controlled grief she had seen for 7 days, but something new, something bright, something that looked like the morning after a storm when the world is washed clean and everything is possible. He kissed her forehead, then her closed eyes, then her mouth. Slow and thorough and devastating, and the current between them hummed like a song neither of them had known the words to until now. "Stay," he said. "I already decided." "I know." He pulled her close and she felt his heartbeat against her chest, steady and sure, matching the deep thrum of the current that bound them. "But I wanted to hear myself say it. I haven't asked for anything in 3 years." She pressed her face into his chest and breathed him in, wood smoke and highland air and bread flour, and something underneath all of it that was just him, warm and solid and real. "You're going to have to get a second chair," she said. He laughed, low and rough and startled. Like joy was a muscle he was relearning how to use. "I'll build you 10. One will do." She looked up at him. "One is all I've ever needed." 4 months later, the Western Cartographers Guild received a comprehensive survey package from one of their most prolific field agents. Inside the leather folio were 47 meticulously drawn maps of the Ashenmore Highlands, watershed patterns, ridge formations, migration routes, mineral deposits, and the most detailed topographical records of the northern mountain range that the Guild had ever seen. The accompanying letter was brief. Tessa Whitfield wrote that she had established a permanent survey station in the Highlands and would be continuing her work from a fixed location for the foreseeable future. She noted that the Holloway Keeps library contained decades of Highland data previously unknown to the Guild, and that she had been granted full access to the archive by the castle's owner. She requested that her field assignment be changed from rotating to stationary, effective immediately. The Guildmaster, who had sent 14 cartographers into the Ashenmore Range over the past decade and gotten none of them to stay longer than a month, approved the request without question. In the castle on the ridge, the library had been reorganized. Tessa's field maps hung alongside the older survey records on the walls, her careful ink lines interlacing with the notes of a man who had loved this land long before she arrived. A second chair stood beside the hearth. A second cup sat on the kitchen table. The East Wing repairs were halfway finished because Tiernan had finally found a reason to make the place whole again. On a clear morning in early spring, Tessa stood at the tower observatory windows with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the sun come up over mountains she had mapped down to their bones. The sky was the violent pink gold of Highland dawn, and the snow on the peaks caught the light and threw it back, and far below in the valley she could see the rivers running thin and silver where they would swell again with summer rain. Behind her, the door opened. Barefoot steps on stone, warm hands that slid around her waist and a chin that came to rest on the top of her head. "You're up early," Tiernan murmured against her hair. The light was good. "I wanted to sketch the eastern ridge before the shadows shifted." "You could sketch it tomorrow." "I could." She leaned back against his chest. The current between them hummed, constant now, steady, woven so deeply into the rhythm of her days that she couldn't remember what silence had felt like before it. "But I'm a cartographer. I chart what I see." "And what do you see?" She looked out at the mountains and the valley and the sky burning its way from pink to gold, and she thought about blank spaces on maps and the ones inside a person, and how sometimes the bravest thing a cartographer could do was stop moving long enough to let the landscape find her. "Home," she said. He tightened his arms around her, pressed his lips to her temple, said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, because they had both spent years running from the same emptiness and had found, in a week of storm and stone and silence, that the answer had been waiting all along, not on any map, not at the end of any road, but in a castle on a ridge, in the space between two chairs by a fire, in the steady hum of a current that had always been there, just waiting for the storm to bring them close enough to feel it. In Tessa's satchel, tucked between the survey records and the Highland charts, there was one map she had never sent to the Guild. It was small, hand-drawn, no topographical notations, no watershed markers, no Guild stamps. Just a simple sketch of a castle on a ridge with a kitchen and a library and a tower with glass windows, drawn in her most careful ink. At the bottom, in handwriting she had never used on any professional document, she had written a single word: home.